I'm delighted to be interviewing Dan Ellsberg today about his new book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Dan Ellsberg is a person who at great risk exposed the lies and deceptions of the U.S. government concerning our military engagement with Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. Those documents came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. Our talk today will focus on his participation as a nuclear war planner, beginning with his discovery in 1961 that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were expecting a death toll of 600 million people as a result of a U.S. first strike on the Soviet Union and China. We will not have time for questions following our interview because Dan Ellsberg has a demanding schedule and must leave immediately following our talk. So welcome, Dan. The journalist Mark Danner calls the 7 wars the U.S. is currently engaged in the Middle East and Africa the forever war. They began with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan nearly 17 years ago. The question he poses is, who profits from the continuation of these wars? In light fashion, in The Doomsday Machine, you record how the thermonuclear war strategy of the United States has changed very little since 1945, specifically focusing on first strike capability, civilian targets, and acceptable levels of civilian deaths approaching billions of human beings. Who profits from the continuation of this strategy?
There are people who, taking the last part of your question first here, who really do profit for continuing what I call a doomsday machine. That is a system that really is capable of and designed for hitting thousands of targets with the foreseeable, inevitable, not desired effect of killing nearly everyone on Earth, if that machine is ever set in motion. And there have been a number of false alarms that have brought it very close to being launched. Some in crises, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there were false alarms, as well as the crisis itself. And there have been others where it was the false alarm is very similar to the ones we read about in the paper every day, where someone is shot because they're thought to be reaching for a weapon, usually almost always a black person, by a policeman who's afraid that the other person is armed when he isn't actually, or when he's not reaching for a weapon, but he gets killed. We've had a number of mistakes like that involving nuclear weapons, like the one in Hawaii, by the way, recently, where they were told, the people were told, that a missile strike was in progress when it wasn't. But that was in Hawaii. We've had false alarms like that at the national level in the US and Russia. So we have this capability. We've had our very best scientists, our physicists and others, our engineers, working for half a century now, creating a system that if it goes off by mistake or not by mistake, and so what can it be other than a mistake to kill nearly everyone? We have no language for that. Criminal, murderous, even evil is not really quite up to this. This wasn't possible 75 years ago. And so how do you categorize destroying most life on Earth? There are powerful interests of various kinds, including governments, but also corporate interests, that do actually benefit by creating the doomsday machine, threatening it, and reproducing it. We're about to spend $1.7 trillion in rebuilding the doomsday machine. Now, how much would it be worth to dismantle the doomsday machine? If it cost $1 trillion, that would be well spent. That would increase the safety of the world. To reproduce it, this hair trigger apparatus on both sides. The Russians are spending a comparable amount. But we're not spending it to the Russians, and they're not spending it to us. The money goes to our corporations, to Boeing, to Raytheon, Grumman. I just read that in the next budget that Trump has put out, which is not that different from Obama's budget, by the way, Boeing Corporation, which is vying to build the new ICBMs, which shouldn't exist, is getting $25 billion in 1 year, which is just a little less than the State Department. And I think Lockheed is right in there, et cetera. So if you say who profits, well, it's not only profits in our political system, it's jobs, votes, campaign donations. Those people, communities that depend on bases, as in Grand Forks, North Dakota, I think it is. There's a couple of Grand Forks, but there's a missile base in North Dakota where we have an ICBM base that shouldn't exist. It's dangerous to us. It's a lightning rod for attack or for launch on warning. So it should be dismantled. But as I was just told in Washington last week, but that would mean that this community depends on this base, which means that 2 senators in North Dakota are for building the machine. They don't profit directly from it, but their communities, their votes, the jobs, and undoubtedly campaign contributions from these people do depend on it. There is what's called an ICBM caucus in the Senate of 10 senators, 2 from North Dakota, 2 from Montana, which has ICBM bases, 2 from Wyoming. Those are the 3 states that have ICBM bases. And for those bases, we're reproducing this thing. So who profits? Well, quite a few people, but a tiny minority of the country. And what is at risk is everyone on Earth.
One fact that many citizens do not understand is the difference between nuclear war and thermonuclear war. Can you please tell us the difference?
Well, truthfully, for a reason I'll go into perhaps later in our discussion, there isn't as much difference as I used to think, as we knew before in 1983. But I have found that most people of all ages in this country, by far the majority, do not know the difference between an A-bomb and an H-bomb. That's not a rhetorical point, but I can't see too well here, but how many people here feel you know the difference between an A-bomb and an H-bomb? Well, a fair number. I see about 15 hands. How many do not, actually, honestly? Okay, somewhat more, and some are not sure whether you know or don't know. Yeah. The easiest way to put that, he was saying between an atomic bomb, a fission bomb, so-called, of the kind that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Such a bomb is needed as the trigger for every H-bomb, every thermonuclear weapon, fusion weapon. It needs a Nagasaki-type bomb, which killed over 60,000 people immediately, 58,000, and about 100,000 more in the next 6 months from radioactivity. That's the percussion cap for an H-bomb. And a thermonuclear weapon, which depends on fusion of isotopes of hydrogen, the first one that was dropped, not dropped, it wasn't dropped, but it was droppable. It was a solid fuel bomb. In 1954, was 1,000 times more powerful than the Nagasaki bomb that triggered it, which was 1,000 times more powerful than the largest blockbuster of World War II. Trump, by the way, just Make America Great Again, just dropped what they called the mother of all bombs, or the largest bomb in our inventory. It was about 20 tons, which, by the way, was rather standard for the British in World War II. But it's our largest bomb. He dropped, I think it was in Iraq, or Afghanistan, I've forgotten. That's 1 million times less than a thermonuclear weapon. We had a lot of 20 megaton bombs, 20 million tons of TNT. That would be more explosive power in one warhead than in all the world's wars of human history. That's the difference. A Titan warhead flew off by accident in South Arkansas, I think it was, which had a 9 megaton warhead, and had that exploded when it flew off by mistake, when a monkey wrench actually pierced the shield, and the fuel started coming out, and finally exploded the fuel and dumped the warhead hundreds of yards away, and took them a while to see it. It didn't explode, though it might have, and that would have been more than all the explosive power of all the wars in human history in our country. I can go right from that to say something, which is our ICBMs as targets for Russian ICBMs, and as possibly being launched, or by accident, are the most dangerous weapons in the world today, the most dangerous to us, as dangerous as any Russian weapons. And if we were to get rid of them, we would be safer and the world would be safer.
When you reveal in your book the history of U.S. thermonuclear war planning, including the willingness of war planners in 1961 to contemplate the deaths of 600 million people in an attack on Russia and China. Did you hope that the present-day thermonuclear war planners would come forward and corroborate your claims by saying that something similar was still in place and on hair-trigger alert?
I'd understood there's a lot more declassified on this subject now, by far, than was true in my day 40 years ago. And at that time, there were very few people who understood the war plans, and almost no civilians, as a matter of fact. That hasn't been true for the last 30 years or so. More and more civilians have gotten into the process, and there are lots of people who know about it. I thought that some people would respond to my book, and I've had a lot of reviews, and I expected some reviewers, and some of them by experts, to say, well, this is history, this is it's all changed, nothing like that today. Not a hint of that from anybody. On the contrary, people who do know have corroborated it hasn't basically changed. Well, that being the case, including the possibility of accidental war, you might say, as well as intended war. Imagine, a war where a president or a Russian has decided, after great reflection, or perhaps during a crisis in a war, to launch these weapons against each other. Well, that will destroy most life on Earth by nuclear winter effects, which we haven't discussed yet. But even without nuclear winter, just by blast and radioactivity and heat, it would kill probably several billion people out of 7 billion. Without the nuclear winter effect. So supposing they did that intentionally, everyone knows that would be insane to trigger these weapons, actually under any circumstances, whatever, against another superpower, against Russia, against us against Russia, would be madness, criminal madness. And what I did hope, and it hasn't happened yet, but what I did hope with this book was that some other people would say, me too, in the sense of, I know those plans and I agree with Daniel Ellsberg, this has always been insane.
Yeah. Well, following up with that, do you think there's a Pentagon Papers of thermonuclear war planning that waits to be uncovered? And do you think there's a Dan Ellsberg or a Chelsea Manning or an Edward Snowden who might come forward to deliver it to the U.S. public and the world?
Well, we existed, and the plans exist, and they look as crazy now as they ever did. My hope was that Gorbachev would stay in power long enough to do what I'm sure he could have done if it wasn't suggested to him, and that is throw open his safe and say, here's the plan I inherited. Yeah. It's insane. By the way, any one of the nuclear weapon states could say that, but Russia above all, and the U.S. So I hope that Gorbachev very specifically was a man who would say, this is clearly insane, I'm changing it. We invite the United States to make its plans public, challenge him, whether he would have gotten it or not. And they would look pretty much the same, with different names for the targets. And he didn't stay in office long enough to do that. No other national leader in the nuclear era has made it a high priority, as I believe he did, to dismantle the doomsday machines. There were others who were actually Reagan. At Reykjavik, his partner there, felt very strongly, surprisingly, we didn't know this at the time, but it turns out he too really wanted to eliminate nuclear weapons. But he gave a higher priority to building what he believed would be this Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the bubble, he thought, over the United States, which would protect us from some rogue nation. Gorbachev actually said to him, if we eliminate our weapons, which they actually discussed, the only time two nuclear states have ever mentioned such words as a possibility, only time. And Gorbachev said, well, if we get rid of the weapons, which Reagan seemed ready to do, not his subordinates, but Reagan himself, why do we need Star Wars? Why do we need this bubble? And so Reagan said, well, against rogue nations, against some other nation that might do it. And Reagan said, I always assume that if we make this technology, first of all, as Gorbachev knew, and as virtually everyone but Reagan knew, who had been lied to by Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, who had presented this mythical, lying, classified scheme of nuclear-pumped X-ray laser stations that would destroy all incoming missiles. Impossible, infeasible. They're not even trying. They haven't been trying that for a long time. But Reagan was so taken by this idea that he couldn't give up the idea of jettisoning the one major arms control treaty we had, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and permitting space-based tests of that. And Gorbachev didn't want to do that because he knew that if the U.S. did that, his generals would insist on doing what the U.S. was doing, and you can spend any amount of money on that futilely. By the way, Trump will be unveiling his anti-ballistic missile proposals within weeks or a month or so. We don't know how expensive they will be, but we've spent many billions on it already. You can spend any amount of money on that to no effect whatever. And who profits from that? Well, the people who get the money. That's all that it's for. It's a jobs program and it's a profits program. So anyway, Reagan said, well, when we get the technology, I'll share it with you. And Gorbachev says, I was just reading this dialogue the other day from a transcript, saying, pardon me, but I just don't believe that. You know, you don't share anything with us in the way of technology. You're not going to give us your highest rate technology. And so they didn't get an agreement. What I'm saying is that even Reagan, who I believe was strong on this, it turns out, had a higher priority to have this crazy Star Wars scheme, which prevented him going for the elimination. No other president has come close to that. I believe that Carter wanted greatly to reduce this system, ended up producing an MX, cruise missiles, a big buildup, which Reagan built on. I think Obama wanted no first use. He went for that. The sole use would be replying to a nuclear attack, which is not the main use for nuclear weapons. He wanted to get rid of the ICBMs. And this was proposed as early as 2010 in his administration by him, 2013, and his last year as his legacy to get rid of the ICBMs. He couldn't do it because he could have if he'd spent all his political capital on that. If Barack Obama had cared as much about dismantling the doomsday machine, for which he got a Nobel Prize after his first year, if he put as much priority on that as his health system, I'm not saying he should have, I'm just saying there was a different priority. And if he'd had as much priority on getting rid of the nuclear weapons, which he wanted and talked about, is that, I don't say he could have done it, but he would have done a lot more than he did do. So he didn't get it. Carter didn't get it. But not only U.S., no other leader has ever cared as much to do this. And so we go on risking this from day to day.
In a recent film, Phil Zimbardo cites you as the quintessential example of the new heroism, the person who acts in the public interest, even at risk to him or herself. Why are you the lone voice testifying to the dangers of our present thermonuclear war policy, as you once were when you exposed the lies and deceptions of the U.S. government with the revelations of the Pentagon Papers? What allows you to be the harbinger of these awful truths?
Well, what allowed me to do it, I can't really say, although I did benefit from something that probably none of these people has had the privilege of meeting, and that is I met people who were on their way to prison for nonviolent resistance to the Vietnam War. I realized that they were very like me, a lot younger, but me at their age. They felt about the war the same way I did, and the best thing they thought they could do was not to go to Sweden or to Vietnam or to Canada or the National Guard, but to go to prison, to refuse to cooperate with the system, to send out a message, this is wrong, I will not participate in it in any way. And they did go to prison. 5,000 Americans went to prison. Now, as far as I know, I'm the only person of nearly my position in the State Department or the Defense Department who ever met a draft resistor. And it was more or less, when I first met them, it was almost by accident. Then I kind of sought them out. But when I saw these people actually on their way to prison, I realized I could do that. So how can I help end this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? And there was no easy way to do that or clear way to do it, but whatever, I ended up doing what I could, which was to put out these classified documents. Now, the plans we're talking about are all classified, highly classified. We've promised, every person with access to them has promised, as I did, not to reveal secrets. And your identity as a president's man, working for the president, is you're keeping his secrets or her secrets someday. Your career depends on it, but more than that, your identity depends on it. Yeah, they have faith in you. They've trusted you to do this. How can you betray that? And almost none of them reflect. I know two people who did, Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden, both raised the point that they had taken an oath, as all of us had taken an oath, not just a contractual agreement like a secrecy promise, an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, in Vietnam, there was no question about it. Everybody associated with that were breaking their oath, nearly all men in those days, his oath, to support and defend the Constitution. Many of us knew, 1,000 or more knew, that the Congress was being lied to, that there had been an attack on the Tonkin Gulf, unprovoked attack, which had not occurred. That was a false alarm, by the way. Had it been nuclear, I've never made that connection in my mind. I often talk about Tonkin Gulf, and it hasn't occurred to me. That is an example of the false alarm I'm talking about here.
Exactly.
A belief, which I believe was a sincere belief by the President and the Secretary of Defense, as well as me, on August 4th, 1964, which happened by coincidence to be my first day and then night in the Pentagon. And I spent the night there watching the raids, which were taking place in daylight against North Vietnam, the first raids against North Vietnam, to avenge an attack on the night before, which supposedly had been unprovoked in international waters against an ordinary patrol. All those were conscious lies. But they did think there was an attack. There hadn't been an attack. In fact, it was a false alarm. And if we'd been using nuclear weapons, well, that might not have ended the world, because it would be against North Vietnam, and the Russians didn't have nuclear weapons. Nixon later made nuclear threats against North Vietnam, which didn't have nuclear weapons. It wasn't against Russia. So that war, almost surely, in my opinion, the Russians would not have entered that, despite their alliance. They would know better than to do that. But in Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, we were making threats against Russia, not just any nuclear state. And we are now making, in the last few months, the President, has been making threats of armed conflict against a nuclear weapons state, North Korea. Now, it's not Russia. If that comes to nuclear war, it will probably not end life on Earth. A thousand times less. In fact, 1,000 times less. Millions dead instead of billions, which would be the case in potentially Syria or Ukraine or Georgia or Baltics against Russia. But only millions dead, more in one day and 1 week than the world has ever seen in that period of time. Probably limited, and that's what we're threatening, which is a threat of crazy action. And what else to call it aside from crazy? Evil, criminal, murderous. But murderous, we're talking millions of people here. Is murderous an adequate word? So this is the first time, in other words, that a president, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, has been making threats that could result in a two-sided nuclear war, even a limited one, even though a limited one. And it's a dangerous situation. So now we're hearing from Kim and Trump that they may have a summit that will avert that. Very good. I think there may be people who seem very uneasy about the idea of peace with North Korea. Let me tell you, I'm not, compared to war.
It seems we have all been socialized, as Robert J. Lifton would say, to the belief that civilians, including women and children, are okay targets in war. In your book, you say that in modern times, this began with the acceptable strategy after World War I, although it was always the strategy in U.S. wars against indigenous peoples. It now takes the form of drone strikes on citizens by anonymous operators killing at a great distance. Does this account for why the idea of civilian deaths in the billions is not only conceivable, but also planned for?
Well, as you know, you've obviously read my book carefully, I'm happy to say. I spent quite a bit of time writing several chapters in there about our World War II bombing, which normally, very rarely makes it into a book about nuclear war. I have never thought, since I've been into this from about 58, that you could understand our actual planning, deployment, design, and threats without knowing our actual history in World War II, which was lied about at the time and known to almost no Americans now. In fact, I was just thinking today, this morning, in another connection, but I was thinking that I wonder how many Americans could tell me what was the largest act, single-day act of killing against civilians in world history. Or I could say World War II, which actually the act is in World War II, and it was the largest in human history. And I won't go through that now, but I imagine a lot of people would say Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They'd be wrong. Those are the number 2 and 3 cases. The first was March 9th, 10th, 1945, 5 months earlier, in a firebombing raid on Tokyo, which killed between 80 and 120,000 civilians, burning them to death in one night by fire, by deliberate means. Now, it was planned for, it created a firestorm, and I won't go into that, but it's an unusual kind of fire which creates a very strong updraft and brings in surrounding winds. It creates its own weather, in effect, and intensifies the heat to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, so that everybody dies in that zone, everyone, one way or another. And that's been what people have focused on, if they ever focus at all on firestorms. The point raised by your question, though, is a little different. That was not regarded as some crime or murder or anything by the American people, and they did know about it, actually. I've looked back at Time magazine that week and said, last week General Curtis LeMay demonstrated that his pilots were capable of burning Japanese cities like burning leaves. Not unrelated to the fact that in the same issue they talked about Marines using flamethrowers on Japanese military, and the headline of that was rat exterminators, rodent exterminators, not human killing. Well, we burned civilians alive by 100 to 1,000. Later in May, actually, there was a second raid on Tokyo, which didn't kill as many people, actually, Tokyo having been burned over. But the headline was wrong. The headline was, the sub-headline, actually, was 1 million killed in Tokyo. Now, there weren't 1 million. 1 million has never been killed before in human history. In fact, it was less than the first raid. It was not 100,000. But it's quite striking that that was in the sort of last part of the article after the headline. And there was no great outcry about it in the U.S. or anything. A very handful of people objected to this sort of thing. It's kind of, I happened to have seen that just before when I was writing this part of the book, and I quoted it in there. I was very struck by that. How could you have a headline in the Times, 1 million killed in a night? And, yeah, right. They asked for it, Pearl Harbor, Bataan and so on. So the problem being that we tried to make a firestorm in every fire raid, 64 cities after Tokyo, never got it again. The weather has to be just right. It took 300 bombers, but we had 300 bombers. In fact, we had a lot more than that. We could do a 300 bomb raid every night, which we were trying to do, kill as many people as we could. There was a 1,000 pilot raid, 1,000 crew raid on Cologne in 1943. The last 1,000 plane raid in the war was on August 14th, 1945. The word of Japanese surrender came as the pilots were returning to base from that raid. That was the last raid of the war. Okay, we had that many planes, but we could only do one city at a time with that. An atom bomb gives you a firestorm every time. So the key effect of fission weapons, I wrote this morning in some notes. The key effect of fission or thermonuclear weapons is one that no one paid any attention to for the first 40 years of the nuclear era. In 1983, in other words, 38 years after Hiroshima, Carl Sagan, Turco, Toon, a number of physicists, 7 physicists, published a paper that said the effect of burning the cities, even if they've been evacuated, by the way, no people in them, but burning the cities has an effect on the smoke, and it lofts the smoke into the stratosphere. That's the effect. Nobody had looked at smoke as an effect of nuclear weapons. In the atmosphere, it would rain out pretty quickly. It wouldn't add to the casualties particularly. Firestorm lifts the smoke into the stratosphere, where it goes around the globe within days and blocks 70% of the sunlight. That's from a kind of attack between US and Russia, which would freeze lakes and rivers even in the summer. Or if it didn't, it would cause freezing temperatures virtually every night all over the globe and kill all harvests. No food left. We have maybe 60 days of global food in our supplies. So well within, and some have more than others. We would last longer than other nations. We would stop exporting immediately. Whoever, there would be no ports. That doesn't mean too much. But in any case, nearly everyone would starve. That's what I've been saying on this. It wouldn't just be 600 million or 1 billion. It would be, at that time in 61, when I was doing the planning, it would have been 3 billion. That was the population of the Earth then. Now it would be over 7 billion by starving within a year. So it occurred to me, you were saying, when I was working on the plan and so forth, if you'd asked anybody, and I'm not a physicist, but ask any expert, what are the effects of nuclear weapons? They say, well, blast, radioactivity, prompt radioactivity, radioactive fallout, heat, immediate fires, and so forth. No one for 20 years would have mentioned smoke, and smoke in the stratosphere. We've known that, though, for 35 years. And it hasn't changed the plans at all. That is something I looked into in Washington. I really wanted to ask people who knew the plans earlier, and I managed to get it. They've never taken account of this nuclear winter at all in the plans. The targets are the same, as if you just ignored it all this time, as if you ignored, let's say, the blast, something like that. Ignored the smoke. So what we're talking about then with ICBMs, are triggers to a doomsday machine on both sides. And India and Pakistan can't do that. Now, they have only fission bombs, but they only have about 100 or so, a little more than 100. With 100 between them, 50 each, they would reduce sunlight enough by 7%, not 70%, 70% to shorten the harvests, reduce the amount of food in the world, and starve the 2 billion least nourished people on Earth. About 900 million are at the edge of starvation already, but you'd add another billion to that would go with just India and Pakistan. And what that means is everyone on Earth has a stake in there not being a US-Russian war, and to a slightly lesser, considerably lesser extent, there not being an India-Pakistan war. It actually occurred to me, this was new, that's 4 out of the 9 nuclear weapon states. The other 5 actually will be mass murder if they use their weapons, but it will be on the scale of World War I, World War II, historic, probably. 5 of them. But 4, in US, Russia, India, Pakistan, threaten billions by this. So I say again, every nation, every person has a stake in this not happening, and not one national leader has ever acted with high priority effectively to change it.
If we Americans are in denial of the supreme war crime, as determined by the Nuremberg trials in 1945 as being the war against the peace, which we have committed in both Vietnam, killing more than 2 million people, and more recently in our invasion of Iraq, killing 250,000 people, should we be surprised that we can also deny being in the crosshairs of a thermonuclear annihilation? What signs do you see that we can awaken from such a legacy of denial?
I don't know how to do it, but it's what I am devoting my life and have been for a long time to try to do it. Hasn't been a lot of interest in this subject. About a third of this book was submitted as soon as the war ended to my publisher, to a big publisher, who said, well, we won't publish this because it would be 1,400 copies sold. I said, well, that's enough for every member of Congress and a lot of people in the executive branch. And okay, I liked having the idea of having this book to hand them. She said, no, that means we won't publish it. Well, that went on for 40 years. And I tried in various ways. I've gotten arrested many times to try to attract, in part, to try to attract attention to the issue. And 17 publishers turned down this book before Bloomsbury took it. And actually, I'd never heard of Bloomsbury when they accepted it. And my son, who's the editor of Orbis books, Maryknoll Seminary, said, whoa, they're very good. I said, really? I've never heard of them. And he said, well, they publish Harry Potter. I said, that gives me my title, Harry Potter and the Doomsday Machine. I don't even, by J.K. Rowling, I don't even need my name on the cover, be modest here. And they turned that down. But trying to get attention for the subject is not easy. Trump has done this, of course, more than anyone else in recent time. He's scared people by his, what seems lighthearted talk, about fire and fury, and the threats he's making. So the focus is on people, but it didn't start with Trump, and it won't end with Trump. It's essential that Trump end, that he be out of the White House, I would say, but that's not going to solve the problem by itself. I would say it's essential for there to be a Democratic Congress, in part because we've got a party that is in denial of climate change, which, by the way, is based on the predictions of that are based on the same models as the nuclear winter models. So I can't expect Republican congressmen who don't agree, well, we don't believe in that. I'm not a scientist, but they say, but whatever. It has to be Democrats, but it would have to be Democrats with a different focus than we've ever had, because we've had Democrats, and they didn't do it. Having a Democratic president didn't do it with a Republican Congress, but having a Democratic Congress has never done it. So when you say denial, it's very clear to me, is as available to Democrats and to the left and to liberals as it is to anybody else. And that's where we are. So I would like to see that changed, obviously.
What can you say about the role of the University of California in thermonuclear war planning, since the university is in charge of both Lawrence Livermore Lab and Los Alamos, or the role of the Atomic Energy Commission in nuclear war planning?
The Atomic Energy Commission, or the Department of Energy, doesn't get into war planning. They provide the weapons, the labs, the two nuclear weapons labs, and now it's spread out a little more widely in Sandia and a few others. But the two main weapons labs are each campuses of the University of California, meaning that every nuclear weapon we've ever had, most of which have been dismantled, discarded for better ones later, from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki weapons to the neutron bomb to the newest warheads, the B-61 Mod 12 they're arguing about in Congress, and so forth, have all been designed at an American university. One university, the University of California.
Across the bay.
So I've mentioned that to the regents a couple times as a representative of what used to be called the UC Weapons Labs Nuclear Conversion Project. Something like that. A little longer than that. And, should a university be doing this? And there were always a couple regents. Governor Brown, actually, is very critical of that. I mean, he's an ex officio member of the Board of Regents. He's very good on this subject, Jerry Brown. In fact, he said he wanted to make that an issue like climate as a governor. He's getting out before long, and I haven't seen him do too much on that, but in public. but he really has been interested. I've talked to him about it. He wrote a very good review of William Perry's book, Life at the Brink or something, in the New York Review of Books. Brown did. Very good. And Perry, of course, is a former Secretary of Defense, physicist, former Secretary of Defense, who has called for dismantling the ICBMs that I've been talking about, and having no first use, and rejecting the idea of a very new expensive project for air-launched cruise missiles, which is just being in the budget now with Trump and with Obama. And an interesting point there is he had initiated the program as Deputy Secretary of Defense for air-launched cruise missiles. And he was now saying, we don't need them, get rid of them, they're dangerous, actually dangerous, not just unnecessary. If you ask, if Perry can't get the attention of Congress, how can I? That's the question I ask myself. If his book can't do it, how is my book? Well, it's very unlikely, actually.
Yeah, it's very timely.
The truth is, if I may say that, you started with the question of who profits, which is, by the way, not a question. I haven't heard any of these questions. I want to congratulate you on these. These are all new questions for me.
I read your book.
And on the profit, there are people who profit by producing these things, and others, diplomats and others, who threaten to profit in our alliances by threatening them and so forth. People in the other countries who want them continued and so forth, the threats. So you need to overpower those interests. And that turns out to be not easy. People don't care enough. Even the ones who care, plenty of people in the public care enough, as much or more than I do or you do, and are very active about it. But in the government, and there have been people in the government always who wanted to move in this direction that I've talked about, always. But they've always been overwhelmed, basically, when you come down to it, by the corporations and by the alliances.
In the case of this, the lease for Los Alamos and Livermore is coming up this year. And so this would be the time.
I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference, I had to admit at the time, who ran them. But it was clear that part of the only reason that the DOD, it was then the Department of, then it was the Atomic Energy Commission, and that morphed into the Department of Energy, basically. But the only reason the Department of Energy wanted California to do this was it put a cap and gown over these warheads. Right. It actually gave them an extra mantle of academic freedom, in addition to classification, from inquiry by Congress. Amazingly enough, Don't tell us what... The people at the University of California had no idea what they were doing at Livermore and Los Alamos, no clearances, no ability to get into it at all. They just provided that academic cover, which made it easier to recruit people for this work of of devising systems for doomsday, and that it was in a scientific academic setting. And if you asked them really, why are you doing this? What is this? It turned out that they were afraid if they didn't do it for the DOE, they would lose other contracts for research for the Department of Defense and the DOE, and so that they did depend on. And they got a little tip for it, a few $1 million, for doing this. And that was also in their minds, well, we should give that up. So these are reasons, but they're not good reasons for doing this, or for failing to resist it.
Feeling hopeless and powerless is a dead end for citizens who want to defend ourselves and our civilization. At the close of your book, you state specific ideas of how we can act. They include pressing for congressional hearings on the consequences of nuclear winter, which you've mentioned, a congressional debate on the devastating consequences of pursuing a first strike policy in the belief that damage could thereby be limited, and the elimination of land-based missiles. Can you elaborate on these and other ways we can forestall thermonuclear disaster?
Well, pressing for hearings, by the way, there was interest in D.C. this last week when I talked to people about them. There have never been hearings in Congress on the war plans or what the effects would be of a nuclear war. Never. And specifically, since 1983, when nuclear winter was first discovered, really, or recognized. There have been no hearings on these effects. That could be done in any state, really. I'd be happy to see China bring environmental scientists together and to say what is the effect of these wars, or India, Pakistan, on the world population. I say China because actually of the 9 nuclear states, they're the one that has closest to a sane nuclear policy if you're going to have nuclear weapons at all. They first exploded a weapon in '64. When I was in the Pentagon, I was in meetings about that. And for about 15 or 20 years, they seemed to have only half a dozen or a dozen weapons capable of reaching the U.S. North Korea has none yet. That's an issue at stake right now in the North Korean. No ICBM. Well, they had a few dozen ICBMs. Now they have a few more dozen. Now, at first, people said, well, they can't afford it. They're too poor. But that hasn't been true for 30 or 40 years. They have chosen not to pretend to have the ability to disarm the U.S. or Russia or anybody else. They just have a capability of responding with nuclear weapons to a nuclear attack. And if we had a posture, a nuclear arsenal and deployment and everything, like the Chinese, which would be about between 5 and 10% of what we have, the world would be safer. And if the Russians, likewise, the world would be still safer together. And actually, even if people retained deterrence to some extent, but no nation had more than North Korea now has. And what is a feasible objective right now, by the way, is getting North Korea to stay where it is, not to have an H-bomb, not to have ICBMs, and to have, they have enough material right now for perhaps 60 weapons, but they have 10 or 20 operational weapons. If nobody had more than that, the world would be a lot safer. And by the way, nuclear winter would be virtually impossible. And even killing billions of people by starvation would be impossible. Is that unthinkable? But North Korea doesn't strike people as the model, to focus on, except in the fact that they don't have many weapons yet. They're the one nation of the 9 that cannot kill billions of people. They don't have enough. They don't have enough cities for us to attack, to burn, to cause nuclear winter, and they don't have enough weapons to cause nuclear weapon, or even like India and Pakistan, to kill 1 billion or 2 billion people. Now, why should any nation have that capability? How can they explain it? How can they justify it? And the answer is, hardly anybody knows. May I say almost anything that I've said here. Maybe you all know it, but not many people do. So this is all pursued under cover of denial and secrecy, basically. And I do think that without, even to the extent in a transition period where people have some weapons for deterrence, there would remain no excuse for having the hundreds, thousands of weapons that we do have. There's no excuse for it except jobs, profits. And remember, by the way, in Russia, they now have profits as a motive. They've always had the bureaucratic parity, let's have what the Americans have and so forth. And now they build them for profit, just like us. So, in a lot of secrecy. So, and the Russians, just like the Americans, would say, we don't want less than those other guys. So that's the situation that has to change. I think you said it's possible to be hopeless. Well, I'm not hopeless. I think that people who are hopeless are not foolish in my eyes, or just insensible of reality, but I don't agree with them. Look, how many things have happened in my lifetime, last part of my lifetime, that were regarded as impossible, like dismantling the doomsday machine or eliminating nuclear weapons. Well, I don't think there was a person in the world who foresaw in 1983 that the Berlin Wall would be down in 1989 and that the USSR would have dissolved in 1991. Impossible. They didn't think of it, and if they had thought of it, impossible. But it did happen. Mandela becoming president of South Africa without a violent revolution, impossible. unthinkable. So these things did happen. As a matter of fact, I won't go into it, it's too late in the game to do that. But if you'd asked me in 1973, after Nixon's landslide election in 72, which was after the Woodward and Bernstein revelations on Watergate in 72. It was during my trial and so on. Ask me in early 73, he's president again now till 77. What's the chance the Vietnam War will be over by 75? That wouldn't have surprised too many people, except I would have said impossible. That requires Nixon to be out of office. He's going to resume the bombing, which he had every plan of doing, and that's going to keep it going till at least he's out of office, which was his plan. Who imagined that Nixon would be out of office in 74? 74, maybe we come. What?
76. Oh, 74.
Can you hear it? And I can't
You're
hear.
right, 74, Dan.
I said 74, yeah, I mean, I corrected myself.
Okay.
The war ended in 75 because Nixon was out of office. It's also the case, I didn't go to prison. I was facing 115 years in prison. Nixon was out of office in large part for the crimes that he had committed against me. The Watergate, the enemies list, the campaign contributions and so forth, which people associate with Watergate, were not proved to Nixon. What could be proven to originate in the Oval Office were the attempts to go into my doctor's office, my psychoanalyst's office, to burglarize that with CIA assets, to my warrantless wiretaps on which I was overheard, and an attempt by a dozen CIA assets from the Bay of Pigs to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg, me, totally on May 3rd, 1972, before the election. And my trial went on because they didn't incapacitate me. Why not? Well, they thought they were being set up to be caught, actually. But when I asked, what does that mean, to kill me? And the prosecutor said, well, the words were to incapacitate you totally. But he said, you have to understand, these guys never use the word kill. They neutralize, terminate with extreme prejudice, get rid of, whatever. They don't say kill or murder, and he thought that was the attempt. Well, the reason was that Nixon believed with reason, not paranoia, that I had documents that would show his nuclear threats. Those are not in the Pentagon Papers, which is a history that ended in 68. He comes in 69. So he thought that I knew of his threats, which I did orally, but that I had documents for it. I didn't, but it was reasonable. He wanted to shut me up and get information from the psychoanalyst that would blackmail me into silence, or when he didn't find that, to incapacitate me and shut me up. And when those crimes were revealed by John Dean and others, when it came out, he had to resign facing impeachment, and that made the war endable in an unforeseeable way. But it wouldn't have ended, that wouldn't have happened without my giving him concern that I had these documents, and without a whole lot of other people doing something very unusual at the risk of their careers. Alex Butterfield, Republican, who had been in every meeting in the White House, reveals the taping, known only to less than a handful of people, actually, at that point. And he reveals it. Without that, Dean's testimony would not have been believed against the president, so Nixon would have stayed in office. The tapes are revealed now, but Nixon has control of them. He wants, Cox, the special prosecutor, wants to subpoena them. He does subpoena them. And the president wants him fired. He tells the Attorney General, like Sessions now, not very like Sessions, but actually it was Elliot Richardson, who was not a segregationist himself, to fire Cox, and he refuses. So he has to resign, fired. Ruckelshaus succeeds him in minutes, and he refuses. And so the public suddenly realizes when Bork accepts it, 3 people have been dismissed in a case involving evidence about the president in one night, and that got their attention. That was the so-called Saturday Night Massacre. And there was so much resistance then in terms of telegrams and phone calls and everything, they had to hire another special prosecutor. And what is the news today, by the way? Rod Rosenstein, the deputy assistant, doing everything he can to avoid being fired, and clearly does not want to fire the special prosecutor, Mueller. So we're on the same edge of things in many ways. But without each of those people risking their career to do something that was not ordinarily done, that no one expected them to do, each one in a row, the multiplication was very unlikely. But with each one of them was required to end that war, to get Nixon out of office in a way that was unimaginable before that. So it did happen. And so what I'm saying is, it'll take a miracle, I think, to get through another 70 years without a nuclear war. A miracle. But miracles are possible, and they're possible by ordinary people taking a chance.
After a lifetime of public service, for which many of us are grateful, how do you want to be remembered?
I'm sorry?
How do you want to be remembered?
First of all, I've been thinking, why am I remembered at all, after these years? And I think it's because 39 years went by and nobody else did that. I would have hoped, and as you asked earlier, that there'd be 100 other people. How often should a Pentagon Papers be exposed? Well, once a year, twice a year, something like that. Massive lying by the government, criminality, and in the country, in the world at large, much more than that. So I would be at most, a tiny footnote in a very exhaustive history of this thing. That's not the case because we don't have that. But after 39 years, Chelsea Manning came out doing what I'd been calling for all this time, a large mass of information, enough to prove the case. A number of things, assassinations, torture, many things that required really a lot of information to make plausible, credible. 3 years later, Ed Snowden. So the reason my name has been mentioned so favorably in the last few years is no one can claim that any harm came of that, what I did after 40 years. And so I was used as a foil against people who are my heroes, Ed Snowden and Chelsea Manning. And I'm the good whistleblower, and they're the bad whistleblower, and they did it differently and so forth. Well, I identify more with them than with any other people on earth. And so I don't have to say, which I refrained from doing for a long time for obvious reasons, do what I did. Because now I can say, if there was a Chelsea Manning or an Ed Snowden in the government now revealing, and Mattis could do this, but so could his aides or his secretary, the disastrous effects of a war on North Korea. I don't think we could have a war on North Korea. If there had been a Manning or a Snowden at high levels willing to risk their lives, Manning spends 7.5 years in prison, 10.5 months in isolation. Snowden, permanent exile, lifetime fear or risk, I should say. He is not very fearful of being killed. If they'd been in the government before the Iraq War, I think no Iraq War, if Powell had been willing to do what they did, or somebody working for Powell. So, in short, what I say to people is, who have access to this, don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are falling. Don't wait till millions have died or thousands have died. If you know that the government is lying Congress and the public into a wrongful war, an unnecessary war, a hopeless war, a criminal war, dangerous one, then consider doing what I wish I had done in 1964. And that is give the documentary evidence to the press and to the public and to Congress, not just to Congress. And to do that, a war's worth of lives could be saved. But in direct answer to your question, I've always thought, if I have a tombstone, I don't know if we'll go that route. But if I had a tombstone, I would want to. He was a member of the movements against the Vietnam War and nuclear weapons.
Dan Ellsberg, thank you.
The Hero Roundtables are the global events that ask the question, what is a hero? You've just seen one hero talk. To find more and join the conversation, visit our website or social media.